Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co-host, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also Senior Fellow here at Carnegie, continuing our series this Women's History Month, discussing how to close the global gender gap, how do we get to parity, and today looking at this term, feminist foreign policy, and how over the last couple of years, it's really risen to a level of serious conversation and serious implementation. And today we're going to have Kristina Lunz join us, entrepreneur, author, activist, co-founder of the not-for-profit Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, the first such organization looking at this issue, looking at how we can reframe our discussions about foreign policy and what that means related to domestic policy, which I think is so important. I'm really excited for this series, Nick, and for the second part of our series. And let's go to Kristina now. Thank you so much, Kristina, for joining us today on this very important topic. Here in the US, we're celebrating Women's History Month. And so we're conducting a series of podcasts this month focusing on how does the globe get to gender parity? A big ask, I think. But one way is this, and it's not new, but I think it's gaining traction, the idea of creating a feminist foreign policy. And I am so excited to have you at the forefront of this effort, because you are, in fact, the first organization to focus solely and exclusively on promoting this topic and on helping governments achieve this goal. But for our audience who might not kind of understand what it is, and there are various definitions, right? There's not one definition. Maybe we can start broadly, a broad definition of what is and what does a feminist foreign policy entail, and then move on to maybe more specific successes and challenges, and how we can apply them here in the US, which is going to be another big ask as well, but we'll tackle that later on.
Sure. Let me unpack feminist foreign policy a little bit. So a short definition could be feminist foreign policy focuses on human security and human rights instead of military security or economic interests vis-a-vis other countries, other states. Feminism as a movement or a kind of collection of movements, it's like 250 years old, and feminism has always been about upending patriarchal structures. Patriarchy means the unjustified privilege and supremacy of men in state and in the family. And in order to have this kind of supremacy, you need hierarchies in society, hierarchies towards women, hierarchies towards people of color, hierarchies towards the sexual minorities, and so forth. And to keep hierarchies in place, you need violence. So a patriarchal society that we've all been living in for the past 4,000 to 6,000 years has been characterized by the ubiquity and impunity of male violence. And this has also translated into foreign and security policy, these structures. So this focus on militarized security and this kind of false rationale that militarized society will keep everyone safe, that is what a feminist foreign policy really argues against, and instead defines or articulates a vision in which the security needs of all people take priority.
I found a paper that was trying to even further give more specifics. And I know these are some of the initiatives that you're working on at the center. Tell me what you think of this. It's kind of long, but I think it may lead to more discussion of specifics so that our audience really understands where we're going with this and what it can achieve. Feminist foreign policy is the policy of a state that defines its interactions with other states as well as movements and other non-state actors in a manner that prioritizes peace, gender equality, and environmental integrity, enshrines, promotes, and protects the human rights of all, seeks to disrupt colonial, racist, patriarchal, and male-dominated power structures, and allocates significant resources, including research, to achieve that vision. Feminist foreign policy is coherent in its approach across all levels of influence anchored by the exercise of those values at home and co-created with feminist activist groups and movements, both at home and abroad. I keep saying at home because I think part of the buy-in is to make sure that, society where we are trying to implement this are ready almost for this shape-shifting and new way of thinking. Do you believe that? And what are some other specifics? I think climate in that definition was one, and I know that is one of your initiatives as well. So maybe we can start focusing then from the power structure changes to more specific areas of focus as well.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree with that definition. If I'm not mistaken, it's the one by the International Center for Research on Women, whom we've been working with very closely, and our colleagues in the International Global Partners Network on Feminist Foreign Policy, a network that advocates for the adoption of feminist foreign policies around the globe. And that is true. So for us as an organization, for the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, we are working, for example, across 6 program areas. And in those program areas include climate justice, demilitarization, defending human rights with focus on LGBTQI and women's rights, feminist international assistance policy. What am I lacking? And did I mention decolonized foreign policy? So we are, with the program areas that we're doing, we're trying to break exactly that down. So looking at specific thematic areas and try to understand where power lies, where the axis is, and who has been historically disadvantaged. And within within our disarmament and feminist peace program, that, for example, includes working on nuclear disarmament, trying to change the narrative about nuclear deterrence, giving the arguments why that's never worked and why nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction will never keep anyone safe. It also includes working on the Arms Trade Treaty, the first international treaty regulating arms, trying to regulate arms exports, that also takes into consideration gender-specific aspects. So, for example, when weapons that are being exported by a country, if there's the possibility that those weapons would be used to commit sexualized violence, then this treaty says they should not be exported. So these are examples how we're working in the field of disarmament and demilitarization, but also looking at the cyberspace and the increasing militarization of the cyberspace and what that, for example, means for human rights defenders in Iran, who by specific state-used software women are being tracked who are not properly wearing their hijab and so forth. So, or looking at climate justice, our program area on climate justice, of course, starting at why are different groups of society affected by the climate crisis in a different way? Why are 80% of climate refugees women and children? What about the power dynamics between the countries of the global south and the global north? Who is demanding and who has historic kind of guilt for the situation that we're in? This is how we are trying to break it down, or even more, not more important, but maybe not even more urgent. All these topics are equally urgent, but the area of defending human rights. Over the past 5 to 10 years, there has been a stark increase in the power and in the funding and the coordination of the international anti-feminist, anti-gender movement, a movement that tries to undermine women's rights, LGBTQI rights around the world, with lots of the money coming from the US and from Russia, with successes, for example, being in Poland with almost total ban on abortion, or Turkey leaving the Istanbul Convention, and so forth.
So there are, we can go deeper into all of these topics. And I think one way to do it is to look at Germany. and to look at how Germany plans to actually institutionalize these areas and in movements in these areas. I think, as of this month, indeed, there were some policy priorities set up by Germany's first foreign female minister, and I'm wondering if you could take us through some of those as an example of how it can be done, or perhaps how a movement to global acceptance of feminist foreign policy can start with specifically looking at the German example.
Yeah, it's truly remarkable what happened on the 1st of March in Berlin. On that date, not only the foreign ministry, but also the development ministry published their feminist strategies for their ministries. So Germany now has a feminist foreign policy and a feminist international assistance policy. And that is historic. And that's, of course, a huge milestone for the feminist movement. Looking at the Foreign Office, so our first female foreign minister in the 152-year history of the Foreign Office, that in itself, of course, is a scandal, and even better that we now have a female minister, not only a female minister, but a feminist foreign minister. The 80-page strategy sets out core priorities, and they're really great. I mean, I'm being asked a lot about my assessment of Germany's feminist foreign policy. And of course, it always depends what you compare to or what your reference frame is. If kind of the reference is other countries and states around the world, and including those states that have a feminist foreign policy, by now 11 in total, it is one of the best strategies on feminist foreign policy. It is comprehensive. It has a fantastic analysis. The development process, including hundreds of actors, has been impressive. So compared to other states, fantastic. Compared to the demands of feminist civil society around the globe, there's like lots to improve still. And that is fair, because as feminist civil society, it's our task to demand a lot to eventually get a little. So Germany and the feminist foreign policy, Annalena Baerbock's and the Foreign Office's strategy looks at the different areas from peace and humanitarian aid and climate justice, but also internal structures. And it mentions projects that it worked on in the past, but it also articulates new goals, which, for example, include that by 2024, the majority, like the vast majority, almost all project funding by the German Foreign Office, 85% is supposed to go to projects that focus on gender equality in some way. So either OECD marker 1 or 2, meaning that in some way they will all contribute to eradicating inequalities. That is fantastic, because that really means a significant shift in how resources are being distributed. But then again, when I mentioned that, it's important that we keep in mind that despite seeing an increase of funding for women's rights work and feminist work by governments over the past couple of years, and the International Center for Research on Women has done fantastic analysis on that as well. Whilst there has been this increase, there has hardly been an increase of money directly going to women's rights organizations, grassroots women's rights organizations and feminist civil society, because most money is still given to like big intermediaries or international organizations like UN Women and so forth. So we're still lacking the financial support of feminist civil society. What the strategy also does, it is actually fairly strong on making the links to disarmament, making the links to climate justice, being very clear about intersectional priorities, meaning that it's not only about women's rights and gender equality, but meaning that the oppression of women, the global oppression of women, is directly linked to the oppression of other groups of society, depending on race, on ethnicity, on sexuality, on religion, and so forth. But then again, whilst, for example, and we applaud that Germany mentions that it wants to support that it wants to focus also on, for example, the consequences and the humanitarian costs of nuclear testing, of nuclear weapons, and wants to support the victims of those testing, we do not see a clear commitment to convincing ideas of how to advance nuclear disarmament, for example. And whilst it mentions again a more strict arms export control, reality is that has already been part in the German coalition agreement in the so-called Rüstungsexportkontrollgesetz, but it has not been turned into reality yet. But then again, the strategy gives clear examples on the work Germany has been doing with regards to Afghanistan, and how when a special representative for Afghanistan was implemented at the UN, that Germany contributed to making sure that this person has a strong focus on women's rights as well. So there's like lots very small and concrete examples, and also where the money is supposed to go when it comes to Afghanistan, when it comes to other conflicts, when it comes to money distribution, but also strong section on changing power within the ministry. So at the moment, only 1/4 of all German ambassadors abroad are women. So the Foreign Office wants to change that dynamic as well. So there's lots in there. And so we applaud it. Of course, as civil society, it's our task to show what is missing, and we'll have a close look at the implementation.
Nick, do you have
Well, I just wanted to ask a bit further on that, because one of the things that I'm struck by is how in many parts of the world, it's the physical security of women that is at stake. Women are vulnerable to depredations, not only of armed gangs, but in many places, it's the very security forces, the military, the police, UN peacekeepers in refugee camps that are targeting women, making life for women unsafe and uncertain. And I wanted to ask a bit about, you mentioned Afghanistan, and of course we want to see the emphasis on women's rights, but I wanted maybe to ask about where a feminist foreign policy fits in the short term on questions of security assistance. Is there a role for saying that if security services, security forces, police, largely made up still of men, as you also noted, the diplomatic corps, is there a case then for, in the short term, that women need to have the tools, the security tools to secure themselves and to secure others, so that even if in the long term we are moving, the goal is to move towards a more peaceful world, is there a role for a feminist version of security assistance to get us to a position where more women around the world will be able to live, work, and be educated with a degree of confidence that their very physical security, their freedom to not be attacked, not be beaten, not be killed, is going to be guaranteed, and not just sort of trusting that the existing security environment is necessarily going to do that. Even as you noted, in advanced democracies in the West, rollbacks are taking place on women's rights. So is there a role for, or is there a vision of feminist security assistance perhaps moving forward?
That is, I guess that's one of the key questions, and it's so important you're raising that. So in general, it can be said that feminist foreign policy, or feminist analysis of all policy fields, be it domestic or be it foreign policy, is about reimagining and redefining what security means for different people. And in that sense, yes, security sector reform, there is like feminist analysis and feminist demands for security sector reforms. There is, and you mentioned the term short term, and this is really vital. This is important to understand that feminist foreign policy really distinguishes between short, medium, and long term. In the short term, we do live in a hyper-militarized state of the world, where for decades and centuries, a so much more money every year is being invested into destruction and violence compared to peaceful structures. And in this status quo, violence happens like all the time. And we need to make sure that those people who are affected by violence, that we keep them, that we support them, that we keep them safe. And so that then can include, and that sounds crazy, like at the first thought, but that can include arms deliveries, right? Because we have accepted that the world develops in a way that even mass murderers are in possession of weapons of mass destruction, as in the case of Putin, for example. So in that sense, in the short term, even weapon deliveries can be a way of contributing to security. But the fact that, for example, the same weapons that, for example, are being delivered to Ukraine, and it's, I mean, it is complex. Germany and not only so many countries have contributed to the fact that Russia has been able to arm itself, right, over years. Weapons are now being used in Russia, weapons are being used in Ukraine. Those weapons can save people from more violence, but the very same weapons are being used to rape women, for example, and the same weapons, and it will be those weapons where we can already now expect that once the war hopefully is soon over, that these weapons will be brought back home and we will experience an increase in domestic violence and violence towards women and children after the war. So the same tools that can in the short term save people already in the medium term will cause violence on people. From a feminist perspective, security takes all this in consideration, that weapons can save people from rape, but weapons can also be used to facilitate rape. So what about, how do we ensure that where weapons are being delivered, that they're not misused in a way that is not meant to be? And whilst, for example, if we talk about militaries, from a feminist perspective, there's a lot to say about militaries, and I think we need like a couple of these sessions only to talk about the military. So let me try to make this short. There is, of course, justification to have securitized structures to keep people and states safe. We now can see that in the case of Ukraine, but the same structures, because of the power that are then given to them, can cause violence onto people, and usually does on women, on racialized people. It's the same with even rape committed by peacekeepers, for example. So we need to build, if we keep building these structures of security, we need to understand how power within those structures can be used to exert violence from structures that are supposed to keep people safe. And we can only do that if we understand the different safety needs of people. To give a very concrete example, here in Germany, as energy saving measures are being implemented, and in so many cities, in the evenings, street lights are switched off. That can be in a world where there are only men walking around at night. That might make sense, because the minority of men would feel unsafe walking around in the evening, but pretty much every woman feels unsafe walking around in the dark in the evening. So this understanding that security means something very different from very different groups of people is at the core, I think.
I think that's a really specific and great examples of how we need to continue this conversation and have definitions. And I think that's why, this is such a great start for us here in our audience here in the US, because I don't think we talk enough in the US about feminist foreign policy. I mean, I venture to say we don't talk about it at all if we're looking broadly across the country. And so this is such an important conversation to really challenge the structure of our conversation on this topic. But I think it's also important to know, and here at the Doorstep, we try to bring everything home to how people look at it, in their wallet, right? What does this mean? What would a feminist foreign policy mean, to me in my day-to-day life? How would it affect me in where sometimes it hurts, right, with inflation and with energy costs? What does it mean? And I say this because in October, Sweden who was at the forefront of feminist foreign policy, abandoned the policy with this statement saying that Sweden's foreign policy must be based on Swedish values and Swedish interests. And that seemed to be very much looking internally, whereas, what I think that I hear and I hope is that a feminist foreign policy really looks at human rights globally on closing the global gender gap. And that seemed to be kind of looking internally. And what is Sweden and saying that, and how are those domestic challenges tugging at some of your work in trying to maybe broaden the lens, and now, but it really looks like it's, in this case, in Sweden's case at least, looking internally.
And it's important for us to understand what's happening in Sweden and how this is a part of like a bigger picture. So whenever in history, whenever there has been, and whenever it happened that there was a move to the right within governments, within institutions, a move to the right, a move to more very conservative, always means somehow, to some extent, cracking down on women's rights and minority rights. So this happened in Sweden. There were elections, government elections. A right-wing government was a more right-wing government started their work, and one of the first things they did was canceling the feminist foreign policy. That was no surprise at all, because the right, the very right-wing have always done that. So whilst it is no surprise, of course it's not acceptable, and we have to understand how this is part of this bigger international movement towards more autocratic states, of more anti-feminist alliances, of less rights and attacking more women's rights, LGBTQI rights. But I'm hopeful, and this has proven true so far, that kind of this, albeit still small, movement of feminist foreign policy countries and the feminist foreign policy movement, it is strong enough, this movement, so that this cancelling of the world's first feminist foreign policy on a state level will not have a long-term impact on the movement itself, especially because now we have so many champions. Like Germany is really doing a good job. Colombia only last week or the week before presented their feminist foreign policy. We have Chile, we have Mexico, France, Spain, Luxembourg. We have so many countries, and really Canada, convincing countries, and with incredible foreign ministers at the forefront, who are pushing for that.
Where does the U.S. fit in? How do you, what do you see on your end, from your lens in Europe, on this front? I personally have not seen any movement, but are you seeing something? Is the U.S. taking a position in an organization that maybe I'm not seeing?
So there is no mentioning of the word feminist foreign policy. There's more. I'm not at all an expert on US politics. That is really important to mention. With the Gender Equality Council at the White House, and with kind of the commitments of more money also at USAID being dedicated to gender-specific projects and so forth, there has been a shift. Even more important, there are civil society alliances that are pushing for the adoption of feminist foreign policy in the US, and these efforts are being led by the International Center for Research on Women, who have been building coalitions to push for that for the past 2-3 years. So that is the right thing to do. If the US decided to commit to a feminist foreign policy, that would be an important step forward. There's like a US feminist foreign policy scorecard published every year to check how the US is doing. But at this point, I would love for someone from the International Center for Research on Women to comment on this, because I'm not an expert.
No, thank you. Aside from that, as a research tool, maybe for our audience, are there, I like asking this question, news outlets that we should be looking to read more about this, or journalists that are covering this area? What we try to do here at the Doorstep too is to expand the knowledge of our audience that you might recommend.
Yeah, there are fantastic people out there. So we have the International Center for Research on Women. We have, of course, us, the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy. There is this amazing newsletter called Foreign Policy Interrupted that focuses on women journalists and feminist journalists. My book will come out in English in September. It's called The Future Foreign Policy is Feminist. We have those 11 countries and even more that are interested in the topic, but 11 countries that have a feminist foreign policy, and even more that are interested, and they're organized together at the UN as well as part of the Feminist Foreign Policy Plus group. We in those different countries, like here in Germany, we have such a wealth of actors in civil society engaged on specific topics, all from a feminist perspective, be it on Iran, on Afghanistan, on climate justice. At my organization, we are also mainly trying to be a platform also for those other organizations and actors, because we do have some access and also capacities to support the work of others. On our website, the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, we have great resources on reading lists on the topic. There's a good wealth of some very smart people out there reporting and writing about it. Yeah.
Well, first, I would like to invite you back for our book talk series to talk about your new book when it comes out.
Love that.
Very much. I'd love to read it. I can't wait to read it and to talk about it. I think this is an important topic. You mentioned, I want to go back to short, medium, and long-term timelines for the implementation and the acceptance of feminist foreign policy. What timelines are you looking at? Do you have any projections?
Do you mean for the work of my organization, or yeah?
That feminist foreign policy doesn't become a niche topic that globally, that when we might, are we looking at 10 years out, 20 years out? As a new generation, I'm particularly asking that because I do think that as a new generation gets into politics, that thinks differently than the older generation. I'm particularly looking at Gen Z and millennials. There are different priorities for these new rising political superstars, and I do think that they might drive change a little bit faster. I mean, do you agree with that? Do you not agree? And what sort of timelines are you looking at?
I agree. I'm incredibly hopeful, but that is also why I'm doing the work that I'm doing, because I do believe we can have an impact. We have had, and we will have more impact. It is true, and we cannot be naive. The international movement against human rights, against feminism is very, very strong, and we have to be aware of them, and we have to keep demanding money from governments to support our work so that we stand a chance at all. But I'm very hopeful. Even here in Germany, when the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy started our work 4.5 years ago, no one had heard about feminist foreign policy. And now, after it came into the coalition agreement, then the Foreign Office presented the strategy. I was on the panel that day with the Foreign Minister. When it was only I, and there was a lot more, gave interviews to all mainstream media about it. It was in the main news of the day. People now know of it. Only within the last 1.5 years, there has been such a major shift from a term no one had ever heard of, to something that people talk about with their friends and colleagues. That is phenomenal. And Germany still has a very important role to play internationally. It is it has the opportunity to really be a role model. And I'm sure, especially with Annalena Baerbock, our foreign minister, who's such an authentic and convinced feminist, that she has been inspiring others and she will continue to inspire others. So yes, I'm very hopeful. I believe that within the next 5-7 years, feminist foreign policy as a term is no longer niche, but it is considered as a normal and convincing and hopeful alternative to the traditional way of foreign policy making. And that we will see many more countries, maybe within the next 5 to 7 years in total, between 10, 20, 25, 30 countries that have a feminist foreign policy. Yeah, I believe so. And yeah, with the urgencies of the crises, the need for new and better ideas is getting stronger and stronger, because we have no other chance. I think it was Albert Einstein who once said that we cannot solve problems with the same mindset that created them. And that is exactly what feminist foreign policy is about. It's a new mindset to tackle the old problems.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's a great way to end our conversation. Looking for a new mindset, and hope to see you when your new book comes out.
I love that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.